As a short description, YFA is a card game. Kinda. Here's some ideas to familiarize yourselves with. So YFA is a game where two players battle it out with their lists or decks of equipments or cards. And, well, Violet, why don't you just call them decks and cards then? And that's a good question. That's because YFA doesn't work like most card games, primarily because YFA has no discard pile. Conceptually, drawing cards in YFA is similar to shuffling your hand into the deck every turn and then drawing a new 7 at the start of every turn. This process of drawing occurs every turn, but it's not called drawing, it's called readying. As the first step of your turn, if you have 7 or less equipments ready, then you ready random equipments from your list until you have 7. What ready essentially means is that you are allowed to activate ready equipments, while unready equipments cannot be activated. The second step is that you gain X energy depending on what the turn is. So, first turn you gain an energy, second turn you gain 2 energy, etc, etc. This system is similar to games like Hearthstone, but do keep in mind that at the end of your turn, you do not lose your unspent energy, so that quite dramatically changes the economics of energy. Those first two steps make up what is the beginning of your turn. After those is when you really get to make a choice. On your turn, you get to activate up to 1 equipment, and whenever you activate something, the equipment becomes unreadied, so the equipment begins to resolve. Resolving equipment is something that I'll go over later, so we'll skip over to what happens after the equipment resolves, or if you decide to just pass your turn. Cleanup comprises of all your equipments becoming unreadied, but you may pay energy to retain equipments, which means that they do not get unreadied in this step. It costs 1 energy to retain a card. That is the turn, and after cleanup, the turn is passed to your opponent, then rinse repeat until someone dies. Another important thing to take care of is what the state of a fight is when it begins. To speedrun, first, each player gets 7 readies, starts with 20 life, 3 energy, and with 50 meters of distance, and the player that has the highest agility goes first. But if they're equal, the first player is decided randomly. And so you know, distance determines what kinds of parts are allowed to resolve, and agility is an attribute that parts have. Your agility is equal to the sum of the agility of all parts in your list. And now we can get onto resolving equipments. In order to resolve an equipment, you must know exactly what an equipment is. If you have astute ears, then you might have noticed that previously I have used the word parts instead of equipment, which are not interchangeable terms. If we can compare equipments to cards, then we can compare parts to the lines of text on them. Equipments are made up of parts, from a single part to a limitless amount of parts. When equipments are combined, it essentially takes the parts of each equipment and then puts it all into one. In order to resolve an equipment, you must first pay the cost of the equipment, and then each part resolves one by one. That's pretty simple, except it's not. To truly appreciate how equipments resolve, we must know how counteractions resolve. Counteractions are a kind of equipment that contains a part with the keyword counteraction on it, and counteractions are special because they can be activated in the middle of another equipment resolving, even if it is the other player's turn, as long as the requirement for the counteraction is met. Whenever a player's counteraction's condition is met, then the resolution of the current equipment is paused, while the players decide if they want to play something or not. If they both agree to move on, or if one player counts down from 20 to 0 before someone does something, then resolution continues. But if someone is playing a counteraction, then that counteraction resolves before the equipment currently resolving continues. Those are the basics, but there are some extra rules to maintain some order when it comes to how we play these. On the occasion that both players can play a counteraction, and both attempt to play it, then the one who played it first has it resolved, and the other player's attempt is ignored. After a counteraction resolves, the player that activated it is allowed to immediately play another counteraction without the opportunity to be interrupted by the opponent. In other words, if you have multiple counteractions that you can play, then you can play all of them sequentially once you get the first one down, provided that the opponent doesn't play any counteractions while your counteraction is resolving, which is possible. If they decide not to play a counteraction, then they pass priority, and what this means is that they give the opponent a chance to play their counteractions. If that opponent also decides not to play any counteractions, then the original equipment continues resolving. The last thing to go about is how to resolve attack cards, which has its own section because attack is both the most common and also the most complicated keyword in the game. At its core, attack is a value that lets you deal damage to your opponent, sometimes, because it's based on good old Kokuya dice rolls. The first step in resolving an attack is that the attacker rolls an amount of d6s equal to their part's attack value. Then the defender gets to choose block, dodge, or parry, which I'll go over later. After committing to a choice, the defender rolls their dice, which is also an amount equal to the resolving part's attack value. Keep in mind that the game tends to pause whenever players roll dice because the majority of counteractions have a requirement related to dice being rolled, which procs twice here. What happens next is dependent on what the defender chose before. If they chose block, then the defender pairs dice together, then the results are compared. What it means to compare results is to check each pair and see if the attacker has a die result equal or greater than the defender's. Then for each pairing where that is the case, 1 damage is dealt to the defender. If the defender chooses dodge, then the total sums of each player's rolls are compared, and if the defender's sum is equal or higher than the attacker's sum, then they take no damage. If not, then dice are paired randomly, then results are compared. If the defender chooses parry, then the defender pairs dice. If at least half of them rounded up of the pairings have equal results, then the defender takes no damage, and in addition, the attacker immediately ends their turn, if it is their turn. Otherwise, if the half equal results requirement is not met, then like dodge, the dice are paired randomly, and then the results are compared. That about wraps it up for the rules for the first edition of YFA. This video will probably be outdated in a week, so please keep in mind that this video is primarily for giving you a baseline understanding of fights, and that the real official source of rules are the rules channels and the glossary channel in the Discord server. But now that you've made it to the end, it's time to bash some heads in. Hee hee.